USC IIGH, we have this commitment to engaging in climate action and sustainability. And it drives a whole lot of our work at the policy level and in our research, both in Los Angeles and with partners in different parts of the world. And this is the lead-off event to this period leading into COP26, where we are actually very much focusing over the next 9 days on charting challenges and solutions around climate change. And we're going to be doing a big global conference that is going to be opening with Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, but it's going to include not only climate research, but climate art from around the world, and closing with climate activists under the age of 20. So I just want to say we're really kind of focused in this period to really think about how it is that we can better engage and be more responsive to the needs that we are living right now. So I want to say something in terms of asking Dean Kite to speak with us. The topic of her talk, when climate is everything, how do we manage the world and leave no one behind? The idea is we really want to spark a conversation. We want to talk about the challenges that are posed by climate change to all of our communities within USC, but also Southern California and around the globe more broadly. And in particular for those with limited resources and where there are long-standing inequities. So our program is simple. We will hear from Dean Kite, and then we will have a Q&A session with you, the audience, giving privileged position first to people here that are in person in terms of that kind of Q&A and discussion. So I want to introduce Rachel Kite, and I have to say it's kind of hard to know where to start or where to stop. So let me try to make this brief. She's Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She's the first woman to lead Fletcher, which is the oldest graduate-only school of international affairs in the US. She was the former Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Energy for All and Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Sustainable Energy. Prior to that, she was Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change for the World Bank, and she led the bank's efforts on COP21. And among her previous titles, she was also World Bank's Vice President for Sustainable Development. I'm incredibly excited to have her with us. We connected first around global advocacy in the 1990s, and we actually haven't seen each other since. And I want to say she was already a force to be reckoned with then. And we are so grateful she's taking the time to be with us today, and for all that she's doing on the global scale to address the devastations of climate and to try to help get our world back on track. And with that, Dean Kite, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Hello to everybody in the room, and hello to everybody at home and online. I accepted this very kind invitation for 3 reasons. One, a kind of sunny, temperate day like this is very nice at the end of October when you live where I do. Secondly, this is a compelling topic, and I'm very excited about the journey that USC is on. And I wish you well in that, and we can certainly get into that in the Q&A. And thirdly, it's very difficult to say no to Sophia Gruskin. She says that I was a force to be reckoned with. I was always slightly intimidated by her intellect when we were back in the day activists at the global level, and it's really lovely to reconnect. And I congratulate you on everything you're building here in Southern California. So I'm going to talk for a while. I've got lots of slides. I might not go through all of them in great detail, but I will leave them, and they'll be part of your repository. And there's a lot to cover. In June this year, Time magazine had a cover that said climate change is everything, so everything is impacted by climate change. This is the 3rd cover in 3 years, which has sort of taken standard journalism to the next level. The first was in 2018, where they took a picture. They flew a photographer. I mean, let's talk about the carbon footprint of that later. They flew a photographer from North America all the way to Tuvalu in the South Pacific and persuaded the Secretary General of the United Nations to walk into the Pacific in his best dress suit, and took a picture of him standing up to the knees in the rising sea level of the Pacific. And then secondly, in 2019, they devoted the whole issue to climate change, showing a map of the world desertified. And then they did an extraordinary art project showing the world burning up with this cover in June. And I think it's emblematic of how fast things are moving, even if sometimes it doesn't feel like it's moving fast enough. So that's hence the reason for the title. And you'll see in this photograph, there's a little COVID-19 friend that we've got to know over the last couple of years, because there is something profoundly important about how we recover from COVID in a world where we have to decarbonize and where we have to do so without leaving people behind. And the question is whether or not we can learn any of the challenges, learn any of the lessons, and what lessons we are going to learn. So I work a lot on the issues of how to finance the transition to a more just and decarbonized world. And in my area of governance and finance, but also the energy transition and food transitions, because they're so fundamental, we often talk about the great financial crisis as the last big upheaval where the world really had to hustle and sort of scurry around to try to reorganize itself to cope. And at that time, the imagination was captured by the concept of a black swan. And of course, a black swan was something that could be seen in the rearview mirror, that you didn't know that it was a problem until you looked and you saw that it was a challenge. Climate change and COVID-19 were not black swans. These are risks in plain sight, barreling down the road towards us, and we haven't got out of the way. And so one of the questions is, are we capable of seeing the grey rhino? And if we can, are we capable of getting out of the way? And what does that mean for governance? What does that mean for our financial systems? What does that mean for cities? What does it mean for local communities? What does it mean for the way in which we think about public policy based on science? All of these questions come up related to this idea that this is a risk in plain sight. And some very interesting work around, well, what do people do when you see grey rhinos? So I mean, it's a little bit like the stages of grief, right? You have denial, then you sort of muddle, and hopefully you diagnose. And I mean, obviously, along with diagnosis goes blaming that happens, and then panic and inaction. And I'll leave it for us to discuss, where are we in that? But I think if we look at the response to COVID-19, you can see all of those elements were there in our response. And so if we were so, I think, caught off guard by COVID-19, what does this mean for climate? And just in case you didn't think that we were caught off guard by COVID-19, we were. The global monitoring body, which had been set up precisely to warn the world, and had been set up precisely because of the impact of the West African outbreak of Ebola, had in September 2019 come out with its first report. And in that first report, not buried in the report, but like in the executive summary of the report, said that we are at extraordinary risk from a pandemic due to a lethal respiratory pathogen. I mean, it described exactly what we have lived through. It said that all countries would have to commit and invest in their obligations. It made absolutely specific requests of the Gs, the G7 and the G20. It said that everybody would have to prepare for the worst. I mean, this is in the documentation. When it comes to climate change, we've said exactly the same things. In August of this year, the latest scientific report has come out and has said, with a degree of consensus normally not achieved in scientific reports, that we've caused this problem, that if we stop emitting carbon pollution, we can slow climate change. We can arrive at a 1.5 degree limit above pre-industrial levels of warming, and that if we stop emitting carbon pollution, we can actually level things off and actually improve. The planet will come back. And I think it's very important as we go through this, the material in the next few minutes, but also we think about our own responsibilities. It is important to note that the planet is not at risk here. It is us that is at risk. And so this sort of anthropocentric idea that we've got to save the planet, and the planet's going to be just fine. I mean, it will be scarred, it will be dated, altered, it will be different, but it will be there. We, however, and other species that we put at risk might not. So we were warned and we did very little about it. So what are we learning then of having lived through this experience? Well, I think some of the learning, there are many learnings, but some of the learnings which are important for the challenge of climate change is our lack of, how deeply inequality undermines resilience at the community level, at the national level, at the global level. And so is there anything about this connection that we now have with resilience after what we've lived through, whether it was the fact that you couldn't buy whole eggs if you lived in Minnesota for the whole, for sort of 2 months after COVID broke down, if we still are experiencing supply chain dislocations, if it is that we have had to depend on healthcare systems that have been brittle. So have we learned anything from that resilience that means that gives us a different perspective for climate change? We have, for the last 30 years, worked on just-in-time global supply chains, which are not resilient. And so is there anything that we've learned about how we want to build a little bit more of a buffer into that? Traditional mechanisms of multilateral cooperation have been strained to the point of breaking. Obviously, there are people here studying the global governance that goes around the World Health Assembly, and when you invite Prime Minister Helen Clark to come, she'll talk about her extraordinary work in trying to diagnose the problems there. But I think that the international financial institutions have also been caught napping. At least the IMF has tried to recover some of that ground, but we haven't seen the urgency in the G7 and G20 mobilization. We haven't seen urgency at the United Nations. It took months before the United Nations Security Council even discussed issues related to the pandemic, and it was the General Assembly, which is the domain of all powers and not just the permanent members of the Security Council, that it was taken to force a conversation around this. And we still don't have a global right-sized approach to vaccination. And what we will see is that diplomatically, the failure to come forward with a global vaccination program is actually undermining the trust that is needed within the climate talks. So it was in plain sight. We basically fumbled it. So let's just recalibrate then. So we know that we're not very good at getting out of the way of risks which are in plain sight. We know that we have an opportunity to learn a lot about resilience and flexibility and flex as a result. And let's just recalibrate. Where are we in the struggle to combat climate change? The goal, and this is a goal agreed to by everyone in Paris in 2015, is that we will try to manage the global economy to be in balance with the chemistry of the planet so that we arrive at a point where we are well below 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. And in fact, the science has updated that to say that we really need to be at 1.5 degrees. The difference between 1.5 and 2 may feel very esoteric sitting here in Southern California. It is not esoteric to cultures which are at risk all over the world. And actually what we're now beginning to understand is that it's not esoteric for communities, especially communities which are vulnerable within our urban and rural domains. So the update of sort of 1.5 degrees as being the scientific goal came from work that was published in October 2018. We have the latest update in August of this year. And there was a message of hope in there, which is that if we do the things that we need to do, then we can make things better. We can arrest the warming that we see. And then where we are now is that 5 years, 6 because of COVID, after that agreement in 2015, that this is what the goal is. The goal is to slow warming. That really every country should be now coming forward with an updated plan on how it's going to achieve the goal. So think about the Paris Agreement as the what, and the Glasgow negotiations, which are going to take place in a couple of weeks' time, as the how. And the how is bottom up, every country coming with a plan. Now, the United Nations has tallied up the ambition that resides within each of the plans. Not every government has filed a plan yet. Some of them are very late. The dog has eaten the homework in a number of key countries, including India, where we hope that Mr. Modi will come with something. If you add up all of those plans, we are not on track. We're still at above 3 degrees, but that's better than the 4, 4.5, 5 degrees where we're in Paris. So we haven't got ourselves on track yet, but this is where we find ourselves. Now, at the same time as the science, you've also had a deepening of the economic understanding of the challenge of climate change and also the economic response that is necessary. I thought I'd switch that phone off anyway. So in 2006, the UK government asked Lord Nicholas Stern to produce a report looking at the economic impacts of climate change. This was the first time that the mainstream economic world had sort of been engaged at a policy level to really think through where are we now. And the most important thing that comes from that report, which if you go back and read it, as I did recently, is not out of date at all, is that the cost of inaction is much higher than the cost of action. And I'm going to return to that point as we move through the slides. This was then followed by, this forced really the World Bank to do the first World Development Report, which is its economic flagship report for any given year, in 2009, which was the failed Copenhagen talks on climate change. So again, looking at the global impacts. And then we came out with a series of reports in the early mid-200s and 10s on what the specific impact would be regionally. So we had a series of reports that looked at what the impact of climate would be, for example, on the breadbasket impact of Southeast Africa, so Malawi, etc. What would be the impact of on the economy of the non-performance of the sort of agricultural system, etc. And of course, that work has now gone on, and now we have countless reports that show that the cost of inaction will be well beyond the cost of action. But still, we're struggling to actually have that embedded in economic policy. And you can see from the trouble that we have in acting in plain sight of the threats in Congress at the moment, that this is still not fully integrated into the way we think. At the same time as the economic understanding has evolved, so the understanding of the financial system to the risks that are being, the risks that we're running every day from this approach to climate change. And this has probably moved the fastest of all. So it was only in 2015 when the first sort of significant leader of the financial system spoke about the fact that we ran an extraordinary risk within our financial system if we were not to understand the impact of the financial system investing in a series of activities which were going to be bad for the planet and bad for us. So this is the tragedy of the horizon, was that the short-termism of profit, the short-termism of politics was going to be ruinous to the financial system. This work then has been covered by the G20's Financial Stability Board and others, and has continued to evolve into a real, now fairly advanced set of understandings of the risk within the financial system, and that the risk is now to the financial system itself. And so you now hear the European Central Bank, you now hear the SEC, the Federal Reserve under Janet Yellen talking about the macroprudential risk to the financial system of being invested in carbon assets in a world where we need to decarbonize. You're starting to see the IMF incorporate climate risk when it does its health checks on the economic performance of countries, which are called Article 4 reviews. And there was most recently in the newspapers a contretemps, because it was alleged that the IMF had altered its Article 4 review to accommodate the views of Jair Bolsonaro's government in Brazil, who did not want the Brazilian government to be sort of fingered in this report as having running an economic policy which was bringing the financial system into risk. But the conversation in the financial sector hasn't gone much beyond risk. So there's very deep thinking within the insurance sector, within asset owners, asset managers, within banks. You're going to see big announcements in Glasgow around some of this. But the question of opportunity is not still fully celebrated. So that means to say that we know that we will need to invest in decarbonised assets and products within all value chains, and that we will need to divest ourselves of carbonised assets very, very quickly. But still, large parts of the financial system are still rooted in the way in which we think and the instruments that we've used for a previous financial sector. So again, we can see the risk, we now can describe the risk, we're now beginning to be more transparent about the risk, we are starting to see people divesting at large scale, but this hasn't become an article of financial policy in all countries. So, I mean, this looks very top-down, G7, G20, Financial Stability Board, do we have risk or not? But I think what's interesting is that when you take this down to the country level, and internationally, we go to Africa, the region that has the most to fear from being sort of de-linked from the rest of the world as a result of both the impacts of COVID, but also the pernicious impact of climate change. You can see that, according to the Economic Commission on Africa, the possibilities of GDP loss up until 2030, we're talking about extraordinary losses in countries which are really struggling to progress and have large parts of needs still unmet, whether it be for healthcare, whether it be for energy services, water, for a healthy diet. So climate is threat intensifying the goal of ending poverty. So as I said, the cost of inaction much higher than action. So I'll just bring that back down. You know, in the US alone, insurance costs are doubling sort of year on year. At some point, you know, that accrues to the public. So that's going to be picked up by the public, either in taxes or other fees. And so this is becoming extraordinary. And of course, for 2021, given the fires, given Hurricane Ida, etc., we can expect that number to go up. Interestingly, I'll come on to it again later, very interesting report, NRDC, Wisconsin and others came out with a report estimating the economic burden of healthcare costs to be at 120 billion. I think that number is very difficult to get your head around. Let's just say it's bigger than the defense spending in the US on an annual basis. And then, of course, I think that where I've been talking about mitigation, adapting to climate change is going to be a significant part of the public accounts of countries and cities and communities. And we estimate at the moment that the adaptation related finance that's actually flowing into sub-Saharan Africa is at a level that's so far below the needs that this is now a cause of real tension in the negotiations. And of course, we continue to do, you know, stupid things. Right? So the first rule of economic management is like, don't do stupid things and then start moving the balance over into another column. Farm subsidies are over 500 billion. Fossil fuel subsidies at 500 billion. The latest number from the IMF was that we spend $11 million every minute on fossil fuel subsidies. So this question of we can't afford the cost of action, the cost of inaction costs us more, but also we are deploying finances in a profligate way, given the kinds of crisis and emergency we're in. Divestment tops about $14 trillion. This is asset owners. This is your pension fund. This is your schools endowment. These things have now accumulated only since 2014 to about $14 trillion last year. And I've been told that the number that will be updated for this year, coming out next week, will be at least 3 times that. So an extraordinary jump in the number of assets which are moving away from fossil fuels. And then just to bring it down to health, in honor of Sophia, price of inaction versus cost of action. In the latest report by the Clean Air Fund, which is a very interesting outfit, philanthropically funded out of London, where they talk about the fact that 21% more official development funding was channeled into projects which prolong the life of fossil fuels rather than into clean air and projects which provide clean air quality. And so even the development industry or the development, overseas development complex is still rooted in an incumbency and in an inertia which is not responsive to the kind of emergency we have. Now, we had this moment when we all got very excited, right? Because maybe there is an opportunity in the midst of a crisis of COVID. And remember what it was like in the spring of 2020, when suddenly everything went quiet. You could hear the birds in the middle of the city again. There was no traffic on the roads. We saw emissions completely crash because we all got out of our cars. Nobody was flying. And nobody was keeping their offices heated. I mean, the economic activity ground to a halt. And you saw in the bottom of that chart, emissions just drop away. Of course, they came back with a vengeance. There was no opportunity. That is not the way in which we want to stop emissions. And so they bounced back. But we can see that there is a systemic issue. So often you will see lots of messaging around, what can you do as an individual? Should you eat less red meat? Should you buy an electric car? What are the things that you should be doing? And of course, there are a number of things as an individual we can do, and we should live our values. But these are systemic issues. The way in which you cut emissions quickly is by changing the way that we move ourselves around, changing the way that we build our cities and design them and live in them, change the way that we generate electricity. And of course, COVID had an impact on global poverty as well. This data is from earlier this year, so I think it would be updated. This is for June, but I mean, basically, we saw a big jump, and for the first time in a number of years, poverty levels go up around the world. So COVID basically ripped the Band-Aid off our ability to be resilient, our understanding of inequality, and gave us an opportunity to grow back better, greener. But then did we? And the answer is no, despite lots of rhetoric from many countries and a lot of conversation about this provides us with an opportunity to build back better. We haven't actually done that. And in most industrial countries, in most industrial policies, we did not use the opportunity to put new measures in place, which would mean that recovery was greener. We may rue the day that we missed this opportunity. I don't think it's still too late, but it does mean that the developed world has to perhaps pursue with more vigor the opportunities. Now, the good news is that there's lots of agreement that there is an opportunity. You can see from this is a figure from the Global Energy Review that really, if industrial policy allowed us to move through getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, putting more transferring responsibility back to the top of the sort of energy supply chain, rather than talking about subsidies, a subsidy to middlemen and people at the lower end that they can continue to use harmful subsidies. If you package access to clean energy for people, we know how to do that in this country. We look at Connecticut, we look at different things that have happened in the West. You know how to be able to make sure it isn't the poor or the people living on low income that bear the burden. If we get our subsidies straight, if we send signals that we can actually achieve a green premium. But it's been difficult to push through. And it isn't just, it isn't just the Greens or the left or the youth on the street that are saying this. The opportunity was recognised, and this, of course, is Larry Fink's famous letter that he writes to all clients every January. Again, there's room for the financial sector to really drive change, but not sure that it's been realised yet. The good news is that in this country, there's a very clear understanding that financial risks, and COVID is a financial risk, actually impacts the economic risk, and then that comes back and comes back to hit financial risk again. And so here, the World Bank sort of explained it very clearly. Climate change produces physical risks. That undermines growth. That undermines stability. Stability then gives you all kinds of difficulties in managing a transition, and if you don't manage the transition, then you have more climate change. In this country, under the new administration, this is understood now even by the Federal Reserve as climate risk produces financial risk. Financial risk then has a knock-on effect with economic activity. Climate risk provides economic downturns. And so this is what we have to manage. So the good news is that despite COVID, we understand the centrality of the risk now. The bad news is that it's going to take time for the policy to work its way through all of the regulatory bodies of the financial system in this country. We also then need the same thing to happen in Europe. They're ahead of us. We also need the same thing to happen in China. They're ahead of us as well, but these are three very different approaches to regulating your economy. And all three need to work in synergy with each other. Otherwise, if you're a global firm, you're dealing with three very different approaches to regulation. That itself brings a transaction cost. So, but the good news is that we have, despite the lack of action in the plans, understood centrally the risk. And then I think just one more figure to show that there is a problem with the greenness of the stimulus is that where these that I've covered, can you see it? What I've done here is this shows Canada, European Union, UK, and France, all of whom really you would expect to have perhaps done a little bit more, but they're all in the positive column. But then you see over to the left where we're in the negative column, and Russia, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Philippines, these are countries that are still growing. So these are countries that are still growing, that haven't been able to use any stimulus for greener. So this opportunity that we had, we've partially grasped it, but not enough. And for a number of countries, this has just been elusive. Now, as I said before, there's this sort of cacophony of agreement that this was an opportunity that we could have used. And really extraordinary agreement on how to use it. But still, we haven't been able to bring this through in policy in most developed countries. And remember, developed countries are where the emissions are coming from. And so I think it is interesting that we can agree on the kinds of things that are needed, the policy measures that are needed. The problem is just being able to build the consensus, the political agreement, the social trust, the communication that makes it possible to do it. And here, I think what's really interesting is that there is sort of extraordinary agreement on even like the specific policy measures that can get you the biggest bang for a buck in recovery. Now here, in recovery, you want to create jobs. Those jobs have to be in the green economy. They have to be well paid. So the amount of jobs that could be created, and this is especially for you, in the retrofitting of the built environment, and then new build, if you're in a developing country or middle income country, you know, these are good jobs, skilled jobs, well-paid jobs, they're local jobs, they're not likely to move anywhere, and they would provide you then with an economic stimulus at the local level, and they provide you with a substantial improvement over the emissions profile of the built environment. So when you have the International Monetary Fund, the International Energy Agency, and everybody else in between agreeing on these things, it is interesting that we were not able to grasp these straws sufficiently. No, jury's still out. We've still got lots to play for, but we haven't used 2021 to the best of our abilities yet. So there are implications for the fight for climate change coming out of this pandemic. One is that there is a sense of urgency that is just not there. The energy transition is underway, but we've got a once in a generation opportunity to get it right. So it needs a big nudge. The nudge is coming from the street every Friday, but it's not coming necessarily from everywhere else. This is about systems change. We need energy systems change, transportation systems change, food systems change. And so therefore it is about recalibrating the way that the economy supports the system today to put it on track for a different kind of system tomorrow. We need new forms of international cooperation. There are all kinds of discussions around clubs and more cross-border projects, regional markets, but these are not happening at enough pace. And then the global coordination is stymied by the great power rivalry we have now between China and the United States and other issues which are pushing climate off the agenda. And then, of course, the price of inaction again. Let's talk then about health as one example of, you know, the failure to internalize the lessons learned. So first of all, there is a lot of work going on, and there's incredible scholarship coming to the fore. And I think there is a penetration into sort of the mindset of populations around the world, but we haven't capitalized on that fully, I think, yet. So the economic burden of healthcare costs from climate change accrues in air quality, vector-borne diseases, extreme weather events, and that's not just disaster-related death and injury, but the kinds of productivity losses and other costs that you see from extreme heat or from floods, etc. The mental health burdens, which we're only just beginning to think about how to cost, and then food and water-related health burdens, which sometimes don't get fully counted in, and some of the recent studies are doing that now. But we now know that you may be able to produce a yield on rice, for example, if it has to be grown completely underwater because of flooding, so scuba rice. But we also know that the nutritional content of that scuba rice is different than rice that would be grown more traditionally. We also know that maize and wheat yields in East Africa, the nutritional content of the final product is much lower under the kinds of heat conditions that we're seeing. So there's a direct relationship between actual food security, nutritional security, and climate change. And then access to clean water, of course, is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And so the most recent study has estimated that in the US alone, the economic burden is 820 billion. So investing in air quality makes a lot of sense because you can deliver rapid, substantial health benefits, you can mitigate climate change, you can support better development outcomes, you can improve the community's sense of its control over its own assets. There are lots of reasons to intervene on a health trajectory, but have an impact on climate change, not talk about this as a climate change issue. You're talking about children's rights, children's health. And I think that there are now some very good recommendations coming out about internationally why you would want to see international support for improvements of air quality in the rising urban areas, in particular of the developing world. Again, not framing this as climate action, but as air quality, and which would have an impact then on climate change. So I'm going to skip through the slides on some of the financial aspects, but in the next 3 weeks, you're going to see huge discussions about how we finance climate change, the cost of mitigation, the cost of adaptation, but also look for the dialogue in Scotland around loss and damage. This is basically a discussion around how are we going to pay for the reparations for the impacts on those who did nothing to cause the problems. And this is controversial and is going to become even more painful in the weeks to come. How do we pay for it? Actually, it isn't that there isn't any funds, it's that the funds are used wildly inappropriately. So we can stop subsidising that which we want less of. We can price pollution. Expect to see more conversations around carbon markets, both regulated and unregulated or voluntary in the negotiations to come. You can incentivise faster transitions. We're having that argument in Washington this week. You can find ways to support the more vulnerable and give them the tools that they need to be part of the transition. We need to boost R&D. We need to step up spending on resilience, and we need to pay into funds. So increasingly, this has to be a mainstream part of Treasury approaches. So I'm going to skip through. These are lots of slides about how we can track whether we're actually doing what we said we were going to do and fulfilling our promises. The final point I want to make is about cathedral thinking. The challenge that we have is that we have to design things now that we will not benefit from in the short run. So cathedral thinking is imagine that you are in 15th century France and you're building an extraordinary cathedral. As the stonemason, you are doing God's work, but you will not see that cathedral completed. We have to re-engineer the global economy, global health systems, food systems, energy systems. We will benefit from it in the short run, but our children, our children's children, and our students here at USC in middle age will benefit from it. But we cannot see it in the here and now. And our financial systems and our political systems are not well suited for such a moment. But it is not beyond us. It is not beyond us. So we are actually now involved in architecture. We will need, if climate changes everything, to change everything, including the global systems of how we relate with each other as countries, how we relate to each other as cities, how we relate to each other as nations, how we manage our global economy. This is a picture of the Bretton Woods institutions. In the late 40s, they designed the global economic system for the recovery from World War II and from a system that would bring us a global economy. Now we have a global economy which is not managed in a way that is fit for purpose for a crisis of this time. And so these institutions will either be superseded or they will have to be redesigned. And that is our challenge. So we're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time, avoid that grey rhino. This is not beyond us, but it will require a politics, policy, and finance which is deserving of our science. At the moment, we're letting our scientists down. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, I have no other questions, but I think it's appropriate to not ask them. And I think it's appropriate then to turn to folks first in the room and to say, if there's any questions that people have for Dean Kite, please to ask them. And again, you're also monitoring people online in terms of any questions that are there. If everybody's going to be shy, I'm going to ask them. But no, please go ahead.
unfortunately, I was a bit late, so I haven't seen everything of the presentation, but I found it very interesting, all the facts you presented about the recovery and how it did not work very well in most countries. So I see that maybe in some very well-working democracies, for example, Denmark, I think had a very good positive negative rate. I see that the energy transition and canceling fossil subsidies, that doesn't work, but at the same time I had the impression that your presentation had the underlying assumption that green growth will work in the future. And yeah, I would like to ask what makes you think that, because I have the impression with the global material footprint that has been rising exponentially like on a growth function over the past century. How would that work out? I mean, the energy transition that needs materials too, and innovation and extraction is declining all the time, so I don't see how this will work out.
Do you want to take a few, or do you want to just?
Yeah, why don't we take a couple, and then that's what, yes, I'm just like, Rob, I had just,
So you talked about air pollution and health as an important tool or an important wedge in this. I wonder, you didn't say a lot about migration.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about who are going to be the worst losers from this, it's people who are forced to migrate. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how that, how that might be also a tool, something that, a policy issue that could help mobilize folks in a way that, maybe in the same way that seeing children, migrant children pulled from their parents, motivate people in this country.
When you look at different cultures around the world, some are very, I want to say, group oriented, and then some are very self-interested. I guess I'd look at America and say, we feel very self-interested here, typically. How do you propose that we're going to change the culture to bring people into alignment to make the expense now for the benefit of future generation, when that's not typical of this culture and some others?
let's take these three.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to ask others, please. Okay.
So the reason to believe that a clean energy transition can happen and green growth, green development can happen is that over the last few years, a number of countries, well, first of all, a number of countries have started to de-link growth from carbon intensity or from carbon emissions. Secondly, the price of renewables and the price of storage have come down extraordinarily, and there are very, very specific reasons for that. But nevertheless, that means that new installed capacity of a mixture of modern renewables and storage on a like-by-like comparison is cheaper than fossil fuels. That doesn't mean to say that that's a policy decision every country will make, because you have your resource endowment and you decide how you want to use your resource endowment, you have your targets. But I think that the need to be able to green your electricity and then run as much as you can off electricity, and then use other forms of innovation within energy systems for things that need high heat, or for which electricity isn't going to work in the short run. So whether that be cement, steel, shipping, aviation, etc., running on green ammonia, green hydrogen, other or traditional methods with carbon capture, this is the direction of travel. And I think that what was interesting about the International Energy Agency's report, the World Energy Outlook last week, was that it indicates that actually that is achievable with policy innovations, the likes which we're beginning to see. Now, the dependence upon the materials that you mentioned, yes, are there enough rare earth and minerals? Are we going to have to move away from some of those materials? Are we going to have to be able to work in a closed and circular economy around the use of those materials? Yes, it would indicate that we will. There are very real risks about deep seabed mining. There are very real political, social, and other risks to the kinds of mineral exploitation that we would need for this electrified economy if we are just going to sort of dig up the whole of Central Africa. So these are all very real issues, and you start to see the US Treasury extremely concerned about how much of the solar supply value chain is caught up with components that will come from China, where human rights issues would mean that it falls outside of the parameters of good policy. So it's interesting to see a US Treasury Secretary concerned about human rights in the value chain around a dependence upon a renewable energy source, etc. So I think that the main point I would say is that these are manageable risks, or these are risks that will have to be managed. But the desire to decarbonize energy systems, I think, is there. But the question is how quickly and how. Now, fossil fuels will be part of that energy system all the way through past 2050, but in many countries, the public, and that means then often people on low income, are going to have the price tag associated with that. There isn't a private investment in coal in India now. All the investments in coal are on the public side, so the public banks hold that risk, hold that debt. That's going to accrue to the public purse. So what the kinds of international solidarity and collaboration are going to look like, we will have to design that. But the decarbonising of the energy system is fundamental to being able to meet climate targets. And so we will have to manage through those risks. So we're happy to talk about specifics offline. Migration, I think that the main thing about migration is that most places, most migrants end up in cities in middle-income countries and low-income countries, right? We tend to think of migration sitting in an advanced economy as something that everybody comes here. Most migrants end up in a city on the same continent from where they're migrating, or in a middle-income country. And so the capacity of the Mexico cities, of the Tripolis, of the Lagoses, of the Nairobis of this world to absorb more and more people, this is going to be on the critical path to the migration flows that are going to come as a result of climate change, as well as the story of the Mediterranean or the story of the southern border of the United States. And so I think there is an opportunity to talk about why people migrate, how they migrate, the sophistication of the routes that they choose and the decisions that they make along that route, and then a real capacity issue, real discussion about what it's going to take for cities to absorb them, and absorb them into cities which are already facing extraordinary challenges as a result of climate change. So being a sponge sitting absorbing an enormous number of migrants when you can't keep your vulnerable population cool already, these are very real critical issues. And I don't think that there's enough focus really on that. So this is something where I think where USC could play a leadership role. Thirdly, then, so I think culture, I'm not an expert on culture, but they're not static. And so you see cultures recalibrating and reinterpreting risk and opportunity and the way they think about issues all of the time. So, for example, on nuclear power, the Japanese culture embraced nuclear power, and then it didn't, and then it will again. In Europe, the attitudes to nuclear power have changed or flipped. As you appreciate risk within the culture differently. I think that there is therefore real reason to believe that younger generations could reframe what leadership they want, what leadership they expect, and who's going to provide that leadership. You're starting to see that. This concept of reciprocal vulnerability, whereby a leader invites. It says, I don't know exactly every aspect of how we're going to do this, but we have to do it. And you invite partnership with communities and with citizens, organisations, etc., and with the business community Is it too much to think that we might be able to go back to those kinds of leadership models? It seems difficult to imagine it sometimes if you're in the United States, if you're in the United Kingdom, in low social trust environments. But there are other countries around the world that are doing it, and I think that young people, are able to shift the culture. I think so. I think we have to help them.
Well, I'm going to ask a question, but I'm looking over here to people that have not. Okay, that's good. We'll go from here.
Hi, I noticed that earlier this month in October 2021, the United Nations Human Rights Council recognized for the first time that having a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. And environmental justice advocates and researchers have been emphasizing this work. So how can we use this momentum to build capacity and further partnerships for rights-based climate policy, local and grassroots levels to national and national?
Yeah, so congratulations for raising that point. So the United Nations Human Rights Council agreed that the right to a healthy environment agreed the right to a healthy environment, and there's been a special rapporteur on this issue for a long time, a colleague from the University of British Columbia, and this I think gives a real fillip to his work. But also then I think there's a call now for a special rapporteur on climate specifically, or if not a rapporteur, then somebody. So I think this is very important. And what it's doing is catching up with where the world is already going. And so you've seen over the last few years a number of very important legal cases around the world that do three things. One, there is an interesting discussion of the legal personality of nature. So this is a constitutional issue in Ecuador and Bolivia, but it's also an issue that has been argued in the courts in India, in New Zealand and elsewhere, where either rivers or forests or I think in India, some like dolphins, etc., have legal personality as well. So this becomes important because I didn't talk very much about how nature provides much of our capacity to cope with climate change. So, you would need nature to sit at the table and negotiate for itself. We shouldn't negotiate for it. We're very bad at that. So that's one aspect of legal challenges which are coming. And of course, if you want clean air and clean environment, then nature's going to be one of the important ways to get it. The second thing that's happened is you've seen cases where citizens, including children, have taken their governments to court, that the governments should provide them with greater protections than they can be found in the national climate plans. This is a case that was brought forward in the Netherlands, where it went all the way to the Supreme Court, was appealed by the government, and the government lost. And the government is forced to come back with a different climate plan. The same is happening in Ireland. The same is happening, there are cases in France as well. There are 1,600 cases now around the world that have a similar approach. And then Friends of the Earth took Shell to court in the Netherlands and said that Shell's plans were actually detrimental to the health and well-being of the Dutch population, and won. That's being appealed. And now youth activists are very upset that Shell is appealing it, and so this will go on. And all of the evidence is that actually the youth may win, the Friends of the Earth may win. So you've got cases against governments and cases against the private sector. The private sector, let me tell you, is extremely exercised by the idea that they could be held responsible within courts for the well-being of the general population. And so this is something that we would expect to see. So this is now becoming a ripe area for litigation. It's a deliberate strategy. You can see that by who the claimants are, and the fact that, for example, in France, it was a group of young people. And you're also going to start seeing challenging transboundary issues, where somebody from like Uganda could challenge a Dutch company for impacts that are global that then accrue in Uganda. So I think this is going to run and run and run. So I think it was important.
So we just have one more minute. Can I?
Oh, sorry.
I was going
Long answers.
I was going to take the prerogative to ask you a question.
Yeah.
So if that's okay. Which is that with COP26 coming up, right? So So what do you think are the key potential positives that come out, and what are you worried?
So COP26 is the negotiations that start in Glasgow on 31st of October. The things to look for, well, so there's a G20 deficit, so the biggest polluting countries need to act with much greater ambition. You have seen a number of countries come with more ambitious statements. Everybody's worried that the US's ambition can't be followed through in Congress. People would like to see China put a shorter, qualifying detail into their plans around when they will phase out coal domestically. So there are some details that are missing. India hasn't come with its plan yet. Everyone's expecting them to come with a plan. How ambitious will it be? Canada needs to do an awful lot more. Italy could do a lot more. The UK has got big ambitions. Now it's got to implement them. So the G20, and then Australia has decided that it lives on a different planet, evidently. And so, so you've got the good, the bad, and the ugly, even within the 20 biggest polluters, right? That's not great, right? So anything that can be done to sort of speed up that transition. Finance would be absolutely essential. The developed world has not fulfilled its promises. This means that the developing world has lots of reasons to not trust anything that the developed world wants. And so when you're in that negotiation, then it makes things much more difficult. We need finance, as I said, we need to meet the gap, the promise for finance for mitigation and adaptation. But then we have to start talking about how we're going to pay for the losses and damages. You will see big announcements from big finance about really quite explosive numbers that they think can be generated by investments, voluntary carbon markets, and whatever. You're going to hear Greenpeace and civil society saying, we don't trust you, and so we want to verify, trust but verify. We're going to want validation. You can't be in charge of this. There needs to be independent governance around these kinds of things. So I think there's a big argument about how do we know we're on track? Who judges whether we're on track? How transparent is everybody when they feed in their reports? And this is not just governments, but also the private sector as well. So I think this new architecture of who knows what's going on and who do we trust, I think you will hear. There's going to be some other really interesting things going on. I mean, some of the new technologies for green steel, some of the new technologies for green hydrogen, some of the innovative ways to make leather from mushrooms, which can be transformative for the middle class, the rising middle class in India. All of the discussions around how to eat a healthy diet, I think there's lots of really exciting things. But the thing that I miss is a political urgency that puts everything that we do in the context of climate change, as opposed to climate change being a sort of siloed item on the agenda after you've discussed, debt relief and things like this. I think they can only be really addressed in the round, and I'm not sure that in November 2021, with the state of the relationship between China and the US the way that it is, with Europe trying to work out how to interoperate between the two, with a developing world that is really rocked by COVID recovery, where we have no global solidarity around a vaccination system that works for everybody. We're straining at the edges of multilateralism. My real fear is that this puts another nail in multilateralism's coffin. My hope is that we can invent a new way of governing ourselves around an existential threat, the like of which we've never seen before, and that there are enough people of good intent in every aspect of society that this is not beyond us.